Have you ever wondered how my mother kept 8 hungry mouths smiling and full, using only 5 basic ingredients? At 65, I know the most powerful secrets to abundance are hidden in a bag of flour, potatoes, and a grease-stained notebook from 1950. Today, I'm opening Doña Benedita's secrets to show you how to feed a crowd for pennies. It was Monday morning in 1968 when my journey truly began. I pushed open the kitchen door while the sky was still that deep purple-black before dawn. My mother was already there. When I pulled open the wooden door, the hinges creaking like old woman's joints, I smelled it. Clean, sparse, flour dust, onion papery skin, something earthy from the potato basket. On the shelf sat a cloth sack of flour, pale cream-colored and heavy. Next to it, a woven basket of potatoes, their skins carrying dark soil. Then the ceramic pot of lard, thick and white, sitting like treasure. A net bag of onions, and a wire basket of eggs. That was everything. That was our entire universe of possibility. I watched my mother's hands move with quiet confidence. She reached for a small notebook, its pages curled and stained with grease marks blooming like strange flowers, watermarks from spilled broths, dried batter stuck between pages. This was Doña Benedita's notebook, my grandmother's. It was a survival manual, not a recipe book. A woman who knows how to stretch flour will never beg, my mother told me, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had lived through hunger. She opened that notebook and showed me entries in different hands, different inks, different eras, handwritten notes about ratios and resting times, and the precise moment when a potato loses its starchiness. Little stars and check marks next to entries that had fed the most people on the smallest amount of money. "This notebook is what separates us from begging," she said. I looked at that notebook and those 5 ingredients and something shifted. I had been raised in a house with these 5 things and never felt hungry. Yet I knew families with overflowing carts, crammed refrigerators, packed pantries, and they were always saying there was nothing to eat. We had flour, potatoes, lard, onions, and eggs, and we ate like royalty. My mother placed a heavy wooden rolling pin on top of that notebook. This was Doña Benedita's rolling pin, rolled out 10,000 portions of dough, maybe more. The wood was darkened from decades of use, smooth where countless hands had gripped it. When I picked it up, I felt the weight, the heft. This was a tool. This was a weapon. This was the difference between hunger and safety. "Come," my mother said, showing me to the cast-iron pot. That pot was ancient and seasoned black with accumulated oils of time. She set it on the stove with a thud that echoed through the kitchen. The kitchen itself was bare by modern standards. No electric mixer, no multiple oven racks. But it had everything it needed. It had my mother's hands. It had the notebook. It had the rolling pin. The first transformation came with the dough. This is where the real alchemy happened. I watched my mother measure the flour with her hands, not with cups or scales, but with intuitive knowledge. A pinch of salt, a handful of rendered lard, water from the cold pump, and then she began to mix. The flour was pale and fine, and as she added water and lard, something miraculous began to happen. The mixture started rough and unpromising, sticky and shaggy, but she didn't rush it. She kneaded with a rhythm that seemed older than time itself, heel of the palm pressing down and out, fingers gathering the dough back in, again and again. The flour dust rose into the early morning air, fine and white, catching pale light like strange snow. The dough gradually transformed, becoming more elastic, more alive. She worked it with such care that I understood this wasn't just about making food. This was about respect. This was partnership with the dough itself. Rest the dough like you rest a child, she told me, covering it with a cloth. Let it breathe. Let it become something greater than what it was. And from that single batch of dough, she created everything. I watched as portions became bread, proper round loaves baked in the cast iron pot with a lid to trap steam. Other portions became noodles, rolled thin and cut into strips that would swim in broth. Some became dumplings, little pockets filled with potato and onion and bits of egg, steamed over boiling water. Some were flattened into flatbread, cooked on a cast iron skillet with a hiss that made your mouth water. And the scraps were deep fried in lard until they puffed into golden, crispy things better than any bakery pastry. Nothing was wasted. The dough was elastic. The dough was infinite. While some dough rested and rose, my mother turned to the onions. These were not just vegetables. These were the foundation of everything, the engine that would drive flavor through every meal for the next week. She took an ancient knife, the blade worn thin from years of sharpening, and began to slice. As the knife pressed through, the cut surfaces released their scent, that particular sharpness that makes your eyes water, that sulphurous bite that is somehow also sweet. She heated the lard in a cast iron skillet, waiting until it shimmered with golden viscosity. Then she added the onions. The sound was immediate, a loud sizzle that filled the entire kitchen. The sharp, raw onion smell transformed in seconds into something warm and sweet and almost buttery. She stirred constantly with a wooden spoon as the onions gradually softened and changed color, becoming golden, translucent pieces, then something almost amber, something that smelled like caramelized wealth. This transformation took time. It required attention. The onion is the poor woman's spice rack, my mother said. 3 onions prepared like this can flavor 3 days of cooking. You start every single morning with this base. Everything else grows from here. This is what keeps people coming back to your table. The sacred use of lard was something I learned through observation and experience. The lard came from the ceramic pot, cool and thick and white, and when it hit the hot surface, it transformed into something golden and mobile, something that carried heat evenly and gave food richness that no vegetable oil could match. My mother handled it with reverence. Lard was not just cooking fat, it was survival, it was energy, it was the difference between a warm body and a cold one during winter. I asked her once why she didn't use something else, something more modern. She looked at me like I had suggested we stop breathing. Lard kept my family alive when the world was rationed, she said simply. Lard kept us alive during the war years when butter was currency. This thick white thing from the ceramic pot is democracy in fat form. It costs almost nothing. It goes everywhere. It makes food taste like it was made with love. My neighbors were crying over grocery bills while my family was eating like kings on mere pennies. They loaded their cars with plastic bags overflowing with expensive meat, jars of sauces made in distant kitchens. Then those same neighbors would stop me and ask how we did it, how we fed 8 people on the money they spent on a single week's fancy coffee. The answer was in Doña Benedita's notebook and the knowledge that lived in my mother's hands. The real pantry is technique. The real pantry is knowledge passed from hand to hand across generations. I have digitized her entire 5-ingredient miracle manual and all these survival secrets into a comprehensive guide for you. This knowledge is your family's insurance policy against scarcity that can paralyze you. You will find the link in the pinned comment. This is not a product. This is an inheritance. The 4th transformation belonged to the potato. When I think of the potato, I do not think of a single dish or simple side. I think of infinite possibility. My mother would sit at the kitchen table with a large basin of water, scrubbing potatoes with her bare hands, the water running brown with soil. The sound was soft, peaceful, and meditative. Sometimes I helped, my young hands working alongside her older hands, learning the exact amount of pressure needed to remove dirt without breaking the delicate skin. The peels, once removed, would never be wasted. She would dry them carefully and then fry them in lard in a cast iron skillet until they became crispy and golden, something salty and slightly smoky, better than any commercially produced snack. They would disappear almost instantly, my younger siblings fighting over the last handful. A portion of potatoes would be grated raw into the dough, adding moisture and subtle sweetness that made the final bread more satisfying. Other potatoes would be cubed small and added to broths, where they would soften and absorb all the flavor built in the lard and onion base. Some would be mashed into smooth paste and used as filling for dumplings, mixed with sautéed onions and tiny bits of egg. Others would be sliced paper thin and fried in lard until crispy on the outside. And some would simply be boiled with onions and rendered fat, then mashed under a heavy wooden masher until everything became smooth and creamy, something that felt luxurious on the tongue. The starchy smell of potatoes, especially when steaming fresh from boiling water, filled the kitchen with something deeply comforting. There is a reason potato dishes have fed nations. The potato is humble, but it is also infinite. One potato can become 5 different elements of 5 different meals. The final transformation was where the true alchemy revealed itself. This was the stretched protein, the egg mastery that allowed my mother to feed 8 people on a number of eggs that would barely make an omelet in a modern kitchen. An egg was never just an egg in our house. An egg was not one meal. An egg was 5, sometimes 10. A single egg, beaten carefully with a fork, would be mixed into a large batch of dough, adding richness and allowing flour to develop differently. The yolk would give the dough pale golden color, an indescribable flavor that made people eat more than they intended. One egg divided among a batch that would feed 8 people. That was the mathematics of survival. An egg would be dropped into boiling broth, the heat causing the albumin to cook immediately, creating those wonderful protein ribbons better than any store-bought noodle. The yolk would remain soft in the center, creating richness in every spoonful. One egg would do this for a pot of broth that could feed an entire family. One egg, transformed by technique and knowledge. Fresh eggs in a cast iron skillet, with just enough lard to keep them from sticking, would sizzle and pop, the whites turning opaque and slightly lacy around the edges, the yolks remaining soft and golden. These were eggs that would appear maybe once or twice a week, a luxury, a celebration, portioned carefully so everyone got at least a taste, a reminder of richness, a promise that scarcity could contain moments of abundance. The empty shells were never discarded. They would be crushed and fed to the chickens my mother kept in the backyard, or ground fine and added to the soil of the garden to provide calcium for vegetables. Nothing was ever truly waste. And then came the moment that made everything worthwhile. The evening meal, when all 8 of us would gather around the wooden table, our chairs scraping against the floor, our hands reaching for the warm bread that had been baked that morning, steam still rising from the cast iron pot in the center of the table. The dumplings would be piled on a platter, glistening slightly from their steaming. There would be a bowl of broth with potato and onion and ribbons of egg. There would be fried potatoes and flatbread. The kitchen would fill with steam, thick and warm, and the sounds of eating. The clink of spoons against bowls, the soft sound of chewing, the occasional sigh of satisfaction. No one at my table ever said, "I'm hungry," and heard silence. No one ever went to bed with an empty stomach. 8 mouths, fed completely and sustainably, week after week, on a handful of ingredients that cost almost nothing. My mother would sit at the head of the table, not eating until she was certain that everyone else was satisfied. She would watch our faces, watching for signs that we were truly full. Only then would she take her own portion and eat quietly, her hands still for perhaps the first time all day, her face showing something like peace. This was the real wealth, I understood even then. It was not having everything. It was knowing how to make everything from almost nothing. It was the knowledge that lived in your hands. It was a notebook filled with accumulated wisdom of generations. It was a rolling pin that had fed 100 hungry people. It was a cast iron pot that had been seasoned by decades of cooking and had absorbed all the flavors of all the meals it had ever contained. The contrast with the modern world has never been starker. Today, people fill refrigerators with plastic-wrapped packages, pre-seasoned components, things designed to require minimum thought. They press microwave buttons and somehow food appears, but there is no transformation involved. There is no real cooking. They have everything available to them, and yet somehow they can make nothing. They have everything, and they know nothing. We had flour, potatoes, lard, onions, and eggs, and we made everything. We had nothing, and we knew everything. The knowledge made the difference. The techniques made the difference. The understanding that cooking is not about following instructions written by someone else, but about understanding the materials you are working with, understanding how they respond to heat and time and care. My mother passed that notebook to me, and I have kept it with the same reverence she showed it. The pages are now even more stained, grease marks deeper and more complicated, new entries in my own handwriting mixing with the fading script of my grandmother and my great-grandmother. The notebook sits on my kitchen counter in a place of honor, and the rolling pin rests on top of it, just as my mother kept it. The cast iron pot hangs above my stove, and I still cook with it nearly every day. I have watched my own children learn these techniques, and I have watched them teach these techniques to their children. The knowledge has not faded or become obsolete. If anything, it has become more valuable as the world has become more complicated and more expensive. In a world where grocery bills terrify people, these 5 ingredients and the knowledge of how to use them become something close to magic. The truth that I have learned in my 65 years, the truth that Doña Benedita learned and my mother learned, and that I am now trying to teach everyone who will listen, is simple. True wealth is not a full refrigerator. True wealth is not a pantry overflowing with options. True wealth is the knowledge in your hands. True wealth is understanding that 5 basic ingredients, combined with technique and care and patience, can feed a family indefinitely. 5 ingredients, 8 mouths, every single week, and no one ever went hungry.